Section 19 of the Convivio. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. The Convivio by Dante Alighieri. Translated by Philip H. Wicksteed. Treatise 4, chapters 23 through 26. Chapter 23. Now that the definition of nobility has been adequately expounded and cleared, and has been illustrated in its divisions as far as possible, so that we can understand now what a noble man is, we are to proceed to the part of the text which begins, "The soul whom this excellence adorns," wherein are shown the tokens whereby we may recognize the noble man that has been spoken of. And this part is divided into two. The first affirms that this nobleness openly shines and glows through the whole life of the noble one. In the second it is specifically indicated in its several lustres, and this second part begins, "Obedient, sweet, and alive to shame." Concerning the first part, be it known that this divine seed of which we have spoken above buds forth in our soul instantly, yielding itself in diverse fashions to every power of the soul according to their needs. It buds then in the vegetative, in the sensitive, and in the rational, and branches out through the virtues of all of these, directing them to their perfections, and therein ever maintaining itself, until, together with that part of our soul which never dies, it returns to its most lofty and glorious sower, to heaven. And this it says in that first part which has been spoken of. Then, when it says, "Obedient, sweet, and alive to shame," and the rest, it sets forth that by which we may recognize the noble man by apparent signs which are the working of this divine excellence. And this part may be divided into four, according as it works diversely in the four ages, to wit, in adolescence, in manhood, in age, and in decrepitude. And the second part begins, "In manhood temperate and brave." The third begins, "And in old age." The fourth begins, "Then in the fourth term of life." Such is the meaning of this part in general, concerning which it should be known that every effect, as effect, receives the likeness of its cause as far as it is possible to retain it. Wherefore, inasmuch as our life, as said above, and also that of every creature that lives here below, is caused by heaven, and heaven displays itself to all such effects not in its complete circle, but in parts thereof, and thus its motion must needs be above them, and like an arch, as it were embracing all lives as it mounts and descends, I say embracing these lives both of men and of other living things, they must needs be in a way likened to the image of an arch. Returning, then, to our own life alone, with which we are at present concerned, I affirm that it proceeds after the fashion of this arch, mounting and descending. And be it known that this upstretching arch would be equal, in every case, if the material of our seminal complexion did not impede the rule of human nature. But since the humid factor, which is the seat and the nutriment of the heat which constitutes our life, is less or more, and is of better quality, and has more duration, in one effect than in another, it comes to pass that the arch of life of one man is of less or greater stretch than that of another. Death is sometimes violent, or is hastened by incidental weakness. But only that which is commonly called natural constitutes the limit whereof the psalmist says, "Thou hast placed a boundary which may not be passed." And inasmuch as the master of our life, Aristotle, was aware of this arch of which we are speaking, he seemed to maintain that our life was no other than a mounting and a descending, wherefore he says that wherein he treats of youth and age, that youth is no other than the growing of life. It is hard to say where the highest point of this arch is, because of the inequality spoken of above. But in the majority I take it to be somewhere between the 30th and the 40th year. And I believe that in those of perfect nature it would be in the 35th year. And I am moved thereto by this argument that our Saviour Christ was of perfect nature, and it was his will to die in the 34th year of his age, for it was not fitting that the divinity should thus abide in decrease. Nor is it to be believed that he would not abide in this our life up to the apex, inasmuch as he had been therein in the lowest state of infancy. And this is manifested by the hour of the day of his death, for he desired to conform this to his life, wherefore Luke tells us it was about the 6th hour when he died, which is to say the apex of the day. Wherefore we may understand that about the 35th year of Christ was the apex of his age. However, it is not specially with reference to its central point that Scripture divides this arch, but rather, according as the combinations of the contrary qualities which enter into our composition are four, to which, I mean to each combination, one section of our life seems to be appropriated, they divide it into four parts, which are called the four ages. The first is adolescence, which is appropriated to the hot and moist. The second is manhood, which is appropriated to the hot and dry. The third is age, which is appropriated to the cold and dry. The fourth is decrepitude, which is appropriated to the cold and moist, as Albert writes in the fourth of the Meteorics. And these parts occur in like manner in the year, in spring, in summer, in autumn, and in winter, and also in the day, that is, up to tierce, then up to nons, omitting sext between these two for an obvious reason, and then up till vespers, and from vespers onward. And therefore the Gentiles said that the car of the sun had 4 horses: the first was called Eos, the second Pyrrhos, the third Aethon, the fourth Phlegon, according as Ovid writes in the second of the Metamorphoses, with reference to the parts of the day. And briefly be it known, that as said above in the 6th chapter of the 3rd treatise, the Church in distinguishing between the hours of the day makes use of the temporal hours, of which there are 12 in each day, long or short according to the measure of the sun; and because the 6th hour, which is midday, is the most noble of the whole day, and the most virtuous, she approximates her offices thereto from each direction, that is to say, before and after as much as she may. And therefore the office of the first part of the day, that is tierce, is called after its close, and that of the third part and of the fourth after their beginnings; and therefore we speak of mid tierce, before the bell rings for that division, and of mid nons, after the bell has rung for that division, and in like manner of mid vespers. And therefore let every man know that the right nons ought always to be rung at the beginning of the 7th hour of the day; and let this suffice for the present digression. Chapter 24. Returning to our purpose, I say that human life is divided into 4 ages. The first is called adolescence, that is, the increasing of life. The second is called manhood, that is to say, the age of achievement, which may give perfection; and in this sense it is itself called perfect, because none can give aught save what he hath. The third is called old age; the fourth is called decrepitude, as said above. As to the first, no one hesitates, but every sage agrees that it lasts up to the 25th year; and because up to that time our soul is chiefly intent on conferring growth and beauty on the body, whence many and great changes take place in the person, the rational part cannot come to perfect discretion. Wherefore reason lays down that before this age there are certain things a man may not do without a guardian of full age. As for the second, which is truly the summit of our life, there is great diversity concerning the period to be taken; but passing over what philosophers and physicians have written about it, and having recourse to my own argumentation, I say that in the majority (on whom every judgment about a natural phenomenon may and should be based) this age lasts 20 years. And the argument which gives me this is that, if the apex of our arch is at 35, the age under discussion should have as long a period of descent as it has of ascent; and this rising and descending may be likened to the sustained height of the arch, wherein but slight bending is to be discerned. We have it then that the prime of life is completed at the 45th year. And as adolescence lasts 25 years, mounting up to the prime of life, so the descent, that is age, is a like period, succeeding to the prime of life, and so age ends at the 70th year. But inasmuch as adolescence, taking it as we have done above, does not begin at the beginning of life, but some 8 months after, and inasmuch as our nature is eager to rise and hangs back from descending, because the natural heat is reduced and has small power, and the humid is thickened, not in quantity but in quality, and so is less easily evaporated and consumed, it comes to pass that beyond old age there remains perhaps to the amount of 10 years of our life, or a little more or a little less. And this period is called decrepitude. Whence we have it of Plato, whom, both in the strength of his own nature and because of the physiognomiscope which Socrates cast for him when he first saw him, we may believe to have had the most excellent nature, that he lived 82 years, as testifies Tully in that of old age. And I believe that if Christ had not been crucified and had lived out the space which his life had power to cover according to its nature, he would have been changed at the 81st year from mortal body to eternal. Truly, as said above, these several ages may be longer or shorter according to our complexion and composition, but however they may fall, I take it that the proportion laid down should be observed in them all; that is, we must make the ages longer or shorter according to the totality of the whole period of their natural life. Through all these ages this nobleness of which we are speaking manifests its effects diversely, in the ennobled soul, and this is what this part about which I am at present writing purposes to show. And here be it known that our nature, when good and straight, follows a seasonable procedure in us, as we see the nature of plants doing in them; and therefore different ways and different deportment are suitable at one age rather than at others, wherein the ennobled soul proceeds in due order, on one simple path, exercising its acts in their times and ages according as they are ordained for its ultimate fruit. And Tully agrees herein in that of old age. And passing by the account which Virgil gives under a figure in the Aeneid of this changing progress of the ages, and passing by what Egidius the Eremite says in the first part of the Regimen of Princes, and passing by what Tully says of it in the first of Offices, and following only that which reason may say of herself, I say that this first age is the gate and path whereby we enter upon a good life. And this entrance must of necessity have certain things which nature in her goodness, failing not in things necessary, giveth us, even as we see she giveth leaves to the vine to protect her fruit, and tendrils wherewith she supports and binds her weakness so as to sustain the weight of her fruit. Nature then in her goodness gives to this age 4 things needful for entrance into the city of the right life. The first is obedience, the second is sweetness, the third sensitiveness to shame, the fourth is grace of body, as the text says in the first section. You are to know then that like as he who was never in a city would not know how to keep the way without instruction from him who has practised it, so the adolescent who enters into the wandering wood of this life would not know how to keep the right path if it were not shown him by his elders. Nor would their indications avail if he were not obedient to their commandments, and therefore obedience was necessary for this age. It is true that some might say, then can he be called obedient who shall give credence to evil commands just as well as he who shall give credence to good ones? I answer that this would not be obedience but transgression, for if the king command one path and the servant command another, the servant is not to be obeyed, for that would be disobeying the king, and so would be transgression. And therefore Solomon says when he purposes to correct his son, and this is his first injunction, hearken my son to the admonition of thy father, and then at once he warns him off from the evil counsel and instruction of others, saying, let not the sinners have power to allure thee with flatteries, nor with delights that thou go with them. Wherefore, just as, so soon as he is born, the child cleaves to his mother's breast, in like manner as soon as any light of the mind appears in him, he should return to the correction of his father, and his father should teach him. And let him see to it that he give him no example of himself in his works counter to his words of correction, for we see every son by nature look more to the prints of the paternal feet than to others. And therefore the law which provides for this affirms and commands that the person of the father should ever be regarded as holy and reverent by his sons. And thus we see that obedience was necessary in this age. And therefore Solomon writes in the Proverbs that he who humbly and obediently endures fitting reprehension from the corrector shall be glorious. And he says shall be, to give to understand that he is speaking to the adolescent who cannot be glorious at his present age. And if any should cavil in that this is said of the father and not of others, I say that all other obedience should be reduced to the father. Wherefore the apostle says to the Colossians, children, obey your fathers in all things, for this is the will of God. And if the father is not living, this obedience should be reduced to him who is left as father by the father's last will, and if the father died intestate, it should be reduced to him whom reason commits his guidance. And next his masters and elders should be obeyed, to whom in a certain sense he seems to have been entrusted by the father or by him who holds the place of father. But since the present chapter has been long, on account of the profitable digressions which it contains, the other points are to be discussed in another chapter. Chapter 25. Not only is this well-natured soul obedient in adolescence, but it is also sweet, and this is the second thing which is necessary in this time of life for rightly entering the gate of manhood. It is necessary because we cannot have perfect life without friends, as Aristotle hath it in the 8th of the Ethics, and the greater part of friendships appear to be sown in this first age, because therein man begins to be gracious or the opposite. The which grace is acquired by sweet conduct, to wit gentle and courteous speech, gentle and courteous service and action. And therefore says Solomon to his youthful son, the scorners God scorns, and to the meek God will give grace. And elsewhere he says, remove from thee the evil mouth, and let churlish mowings be far from thee. Whereby it appeareth that this sweetness is necessary, as has been said. And further the emotion of abashment is needed to this period of life, and therefore in this period the good and noble nature manifests it as the text says. And since abashment is the most obvious token of nobleness in adolescence, for it is then supremely needful for the right foundation of our life, which is what the noble nature purposes, we must diligently speak thereof some little. I say that by abashment I understand 3 emotions necessary for the right founding of our life. The first is bemazement, the second is pudicity, the third is shame, although the common folk perceives not this distinction. And all these 3 are needful to this period of life for this reason: the period needs to be reverent and desirous of knowledge. This period needs to be restrained, so as not to transgress. This period needs to be penitent for error, so as not to become hardened in erring. and all of these make up the emotions mentioned above, which are vulgarly called abashment. For bemazement is bewilderment of mind on seeing or hearing, or in any wise perceiving, great and wonderful things. For in so far as they appear great, they make him who perceives them reverent towards them, and in so far as they appear wonderful, they make him who perceives them desirous to have knowledge of them. And therefore the ancient kings contrived magnificent works of gold and gem and artful machinations in their mansions, that they who beheld them should be bemazed, and therefore reverent, and should make question of the honorable conditions of the king. And therefore says Statius, the sweet poem in the first of the story of Thebes, that when Adrastus, king of the Argives, saw Polynices clad in a lion's hide, and saw Tydeus covered with the hide of a wild boar, and minded him of the answer which Apollo had given concerning his daughters, that he was bemazed, and therefore the more reverent and the more desirous to know. Pudicity is a shrinking of the mind from foul things, with the fear of falling into them, as we see in virgins and in good women and in the adolescent, who are so modest that not only where they are urged or tempted to err, but where only a bare imagination of venereal pleasure can be found place, all are painted in the face with pale or with red color. Wherefore says the above named poet in the first book of Thebes, just cited, that when Aceste, the nurse of Argia and of Daphiel, daughters of the king Adrastus, brought them before the eyes of their august father in the presence of two strangers, to wit, Polynices and Tydeus, the virgins became pale and red, and their eyes fled from every other regard and kept turned only to their father's face, as though secure. Oh, how many faults does this pudicity restrain! How many unseemly acts and demands does it put to silence! How many unseemly desires does it rein back! How many evil temptations does it not abash, not only in the modest person's self, but in him who looks thereon! How many foul words does it hold back! For as Tully says in the first of the Offices, there is no foul act that is not foul to mention. And accordingly, a clean and noble man never so speaks that his words would be unseemly for a woman. Oh, how ill it becomes the man who goes in search of honor to speak of things which would be unseemly in the mouth of any woman. Shame is fear of disgrace for a fault committed. And from this fear springs repentance for the fault, which has in itself a bitterness which is a chastisement against repeating the fault. Wherefore this same poet says in that same passage that, when Polynices was questioned by King Adrastus of his origin, he hesitated before speaking, for shame of the fault he had committed against his father, and further for the faults of Oedipus his father, which seemed to leave their trace in the shame of the son. And he did not mention his father, but his ancestors and his land and his mother. And by all this it well appears that shame is necessary to this period of life. And not only does the noble nature display obedience, sweetness, and abashment in this age, but it displays beauty and agility of body, as the text says when it declares, and adorns the person. And this adorns is a verb and not a noun. I mean a verb indicative, present tense, and third person. And here be it known that this effect also is necessary for the excellence of our life, for our soul must needs accomplish a great part of its doings by a bodily organ, and it accomplishes them well when the body is well ordained and disposed in its parts. And when it is well ordained and disposed, then it is beauteous as a whole and in its parts, for the due order of our members conveys the pleasure of a certain wondrous harmony, and their right disposition, that is their health, throws over them a color lovely to behold. And so to say that the noble nature beautifies its body and makes it comely and alert is to say not less than it adjusts to the perfection of order. And this together with the other things that have been discoursed of appears to be needful to adolescence, and these are the things which noble the soul, that is the noble nature, being, as said above, a thing sown by divine providence, designs for it in its first stage. Chapter 26. Now that we have discoursed upon the first section of this part, which shows whereby we may recognize the noble man by outward tokens, we are to proceed to the second section thereof, which begins, In manhood temperate and brave. It says then that as the noble nature in adolescence shows itself to be obedient, sweet, and alive to shame, giving adornment to the person, so in the prime of life it is temperate and brave and loving and courteous and loyal, which 5 things appear and are necessary to our perfection in so far as has respect to ourselves. And concerning this we are to know that everything which the noble nature prepares in the first period of life is provided and ordained by the foresight of universal nature, which ordains particular nature to her perfection. This perfection of ours may be considered in 2 ways. It may be considered as having respect to ourselves, and this perfection should be reached in the prime of our life, which is its apex. Or it may be considered as having respect to others, and since it is necessary first to be perfect and then to communicate perfection to others, this second perfection must needs be had after that age, to wit in old age, as will be said below. Here then must be called to mind the discourse contained above in the 22nd chapter of this treatise concerning the appetite which is born in us from our beginning. This appetite never doth aught else save pursue and flee, and whensoever it pursues the right thing in the right degree, and flees the right thing in the right degree, man is within the boundaries of his perfection. But this appetite must needs be ridden by reason. For just as a horse let loose, however noble he may be by nature, does not conduct himself aright by himself without a good rider, so this appetite which is known as irritable and appetitive, however noble it may be, must needs obey reason, which guides it with rein and with spurs, like a good horseman. The rein it uses when appetite is in pursuit, and this rein is called temperance, which shows the limit up to which the pursuit is to be carried. The spur it uses when appetite is fleeing, to make it return to the place whence it seeks to flee. And this spur is called courage, or consciousness of greatness, which virtue shows us where to make a stand and fight. And thus restrained, Virgil, our greatest poet, shows Aeneas to have been in that part of the Aeneid where this period of life is represented, which part embraces the 4th, the 5th, and the 6th books of the Aeneid. And how great a restraint was that, when having received from Dido so much solace as will be discoursed of below in the 7th treatise, and experiencing such a delight with her, he departed to follow a path honorable and praiseworthy and fruitful, as written in the 4th of the Aeneid. How great spurring was that, when the same Aeneas hardened himself to enter alone with the Sibyl into hell and search for the soul of his father Anchises, in the face of so many perils, as is shown in the 6th of the aforesaid story. Whereby it appears how in manhood it behoves us for our perfection to be temperate and brave. And this is what goodness of nature accomplishes and shows forth, as the text expressly says. Moreover, it is needful to this period of life, for its perfection to be loving, because it behoves it to look back and fore as being itself in the meridian circle. It behoves it to love its elders, from whom it has received being and sustenance and instruction, so that it may not seem ungrateful. It behoves it to love its juniors, so that loving them it may give them of its benefits, by whom then in its lessening prosperity it may itself be sustained and honored. And this love the above named poet shows that Aeneas had in the above mentioned 5th book, when he left the aged Trojans in Sicily, commending them to Ascetes and releasing them from their toils, and when in that place he instructed Ascanius his son with the other young people in tournament. Whereby it appears that love is necessary to this period, as the text says. Further, it is needful to this period of life to be courteous, for although it becomes every age to be of courteous ways, yet to this age above all it is needful to practise them, since on the other hand age cannot do so because of its gravity and the severity which is demanded of it, and still more in the decrepitude. And this courtesy that most lofty poet shows Aeneas to have had in the above said 6th book, where he says that Aeneas, king as he was, to honor the corpse of the dead Misenus, who had been Hector's trumpeter, and had afterwards commended himself to him, girt himself and took the axe to help hew the wood for the fire which was to burn the dead body, as was their custom. Wherefore it is clear that this quality is required in manhood, and therefore the noble soul displays it in this age, as was said. Further, it is needful to this period of life to be loyal. Loyalty is the following out and putting into action of that which the laws dictate, and this is especially fitting for one in the prime of life. For the adolescent, as has been said, because of his minority, deserves pardon on easy terms; the senior ought to be just in virtue of his wider experience, and should follow the laws only in so far as his own right judgment and the law are one and the same thing; and he should follow his own just mind as it were without any law, which the man in his prime cannot do. And let it suffice that he observes the law and delights in observing it, just as the above said poet in the above said 5th book declares that Aeneas did, when he instituted the games in Sicily on the anniversary of his father's death; for he loyally gave to each one of the victors what he promised for the victory, as was their ancient usage, which was their law. Wherefore it is manifest that to this period of life loyalty, courtesy, love, courage, and temperance are needful, as says the text which we are now discussing, and therefore the noble soul reveals them all. Section 19.